Grazie, Andrea. The University of Innsbruck is proud to be a part of this ambitious Interact project. The connection across the historical borders of Tyrol offers us not only the opportunity to establish contact with Italian researchers, but also to better integrate ourselves in the international research. First, I want to mention the team from Innsbruck. First, the project leader, Professor Harald Stadler, who sadly can't be with us today here. Then Michael Hölzl, you will hear from him very soon, and me. In the course of the project, we were mainly responsible for researching the historical iron mining in the former county of Tyrol, as well as recording and documenting weapons of Tyrolean and Bellunese origin in museums and collections all over the world. So far, they were accessible. The region around Belluno did not belong to the county of Tyrol, but was part of Veneto and is still part of Veneto. However, the territory is not only closely linked to Tyrol due to its proximity, but also because the iron used by Bellunese swordsmiths to make blades comes, among others, from Fursil, which was part of the county of Tyrol and thus the Holy Roman Empire. Today I will provide you an overview of our research. The focus lies hereby on the High and Late Middle Ages and thus on the early period of sword production in Belluno and Tyrol. So far, we were able to register almost 500 etched weapons of all kinds in museums and collections that are associated with Belluno and the Tyrolean region. Close examination has shown that around 200 of them can be assigned with certainty and about 100 that are very probably from this region. This is due to the fact that very often significant blade marks are missing, and only stylistic similarities allow us to deduce a provenance from the Alps. While 70 weapons marked as such did not come from Belluno, we have also been able to find a surprisingly high proportion of imitations. Here I will just mention one example that shows us that imitations are not always artistically inferior. It is a basket-hilted sword from the position of the English King George III. And the remarkable feature of this weapon is the inscription Andrea Ferrara, from the famous Italian bladesmith working in the Belluno area, as we had heard already today. And these imitations started practically at the same time as Ferrara worked in Belluno, and some can be found until the 19th century, so more than 200 years after the death of the swordsmith. In this sense, this claymore of George III can be rather called an homage than an imitation. For comparison, we were able to document an original blade by Andrea Ferrara at the castle Tratzberg near Innsbruck. This is a shortened short sword, a so-called storta, with a handle that is not contemporary with the blade. But characteristic are the stamped names Andrea and Ferrara, as you can see, each made with a single stamp, as well as the serrated sickle mark above and below the names. Apart from a few high medieval weapons, production in the regions around Belluno seems to start slowly in the 14th century and increases to a first peak around 1500 and then another around 1600, before the production ceases in the second half of the 17th century. Everything that follows are mainly imitations or forgeries. The first heyday, around 1500, the first peak, is closely linked to the rise of Venice as the dominant maritime power of the Mediterranean, as well as the maximum production of the iron mines around Fursil. The Serenissima needed huge quantities of etched weapons for its armies on land and sea. For this reason, numerous pole arms, such as guisarmes, here from Vienna, or partisans are mainly found in this period. In addition, Bellunese bladesmiths produced thousands of blades for infantry swords. The so-called spade schiavone have a square solid pommel and a broad cutting blade with an accentuated tip. The very height of the blade production takes place around 1600, and it's closely associated with several important makers such as Pietro de Formegan or the brothers Andrea and Sandona Ferrara, which produced thousands of sword blades, ranging from simple infantry swords to elaborated rapiers, such as this very elegant rapier from Pietro de Formegan. Characteristic of this late phase are next to the rapier, also the schiavona, which is fully established around 1600, and various forms of messer or stortas. In addition to these mass-produced items, the smiths of the regions also made particularly skillful and striking weapons. For an example, I will show you 3 weapons that originate from the area. Let us start with a simple but very elegant sword from the former armory of the Mamelukes in Alexandria, Egypt. Hundreds of these swords came to Egypt from Venice via Cyprus with a complicated history. But this magnificent example of a thrusting sword with an almost triangular blade is in superb condition. It was not only the research into the provenance of the weapons that made it possible to assign it to Belluno, but also these simple smithery marks in the right corner that you can see. We call them Bellunese knots. And these knots occur from the 14th to the 17th century and are one of the most important indication of the Bellunese bladesmiths. Another fine example from Belluno is housed nowadays in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. This is a ceremonial sword for Emperor Frederick III, and it has a very broad blade, of which the hilt is influenced by late Gothic architectural elements. The blade has 2 narrow fullers, as well as a mark that indicates the Belluno region. And the third sword that I will show you in this section is made for the son of Frederick I, namely Emperor Maximilian I. It is probably one of the most beautiful swords ever made in Tyrol. This is a ceremonial sword made in 1496 of Hans Sommersberger from Hall in Tyrol. The blade of these 200 swords has a cellular ground surface, as you can see in the left down corner, is completely blued and gilded with symbolic figures and ornaments. The grip shows miniaturized Gothic masonry as well as heraldic symbols. We have now seen some particularly impressive weapons that originated in our region, but are no longer here. This is because swords are highly mobile objects. This may be obvious, but it cannot be pointed out enough that swords were a highly demanded trade item and were negotiated over thousands of kilometers already in the early Middle Ages. The weapons we have documented are connected to the territory either through smithery marks or because they were found here. In the following, I would present you some of the most important pieces that show the development of the sword in the region from the 10th to the 15th century. Let us start with the oldest weapon in our project, which is likely to have come from a river in the region. We don't know exactly where from. At first glance, it looks a bit strange, and it has a long blade with parallel cutting edges, the taper only at the tip. Also, the brasil nut pommel seems not to fit right, but as recent studies, among others by Stefan Meder, have shown this characteristic pommel shape appears already in the 9th century, for example, in the Utrecht Psalter. So we can think this sword as a late spada that bears an early form of the bracelet pommel and can thus be dated in the 9th to 10th century. A sword that we know exactly where it came from derives from Santo Stefano di Cadore, around 30 kilometers north of Belluno. Here on the Col dei Morti, the old road between Danta and the main village Santo Stefano di Cadore, in 1992, two mushroom pickers found an especially rare type of sword. As you can see it here, it is a bit deformed since its bearer was probably killed by an avalanche in the winter. About the sword itself, it corresponds to the type 11 according to Oakeshott, and it's characterized by its long and very narrow shape. Its cutting edges run almost parallel until they end in a rounded tip. And also the fuller, the central, is very narrow and reaches almost the tip. The handle is relatively short and only suitable for one hand. And although the sword appears massive, it weighs only 1.15 kilogram. It is moreover a sword specially designed for fighting on horseback. It marks so the transition from early medieval foot warriors to mounted fighters. The sword from Santo Stefano di Cadore is also an interesting piece because there are almost no comparisons in the Alpine regions. We can perhaps even assume that it's a local production, but since the sword bears no smithery marks, we cannot be sure. From the southeast of our region, we go all the way to the northwest, where in 2017 there was a spectacular find at the Fernpass, recovered by our restorer Ulrike Töchterle. It is 2 fragments of a high medieval sword, which has some special features. Firstly, the pommel and the quillons are missing, and there is a hole in the tang. That's very strange for a sword. And remnants of the hilt wood are still present. Perhaps this sword was later used as a sort of a messer, perhaps. In any case, the sword was deposited near the pass, since it lay horizontally in the ground, and one can even still recognize the sword belt that was wrapped around the tip of the sword, complete with sword buckle. And also a part of the leather scabbard has survived. The most unusual feature of the sword, however, is its inscription. The interpretation is difficult, and from various approaches I would like to mention just one here, namely, Benedicat in nomine Trinitatis, Mater, perhaps also me or mihi, Pater, Filius et, which translates roughly to blessings in the name of the Trinity, the Mother, the Father, the Son, and leaving out the Holy Ghost. Another sword with an inscription comes from a private collection near Innsbruck, but its inscription is easier to read. Here someone has reworked a large type 13 war sword in the historicistic style, shortened it and fitted a new handle that does not fit at all and makes it looking more like a theater requisite than an actual war sword. The blade itself is remarkably well preserved, still flexible and truly a masterpiece. But even more impressive is the inscription, namely IHS, which is the nomen sacrum for Jesus, Maria spes mea, es Georgi miles expi Christi, libera me, which we can translate to Jesus and Mary, you are my hope, and Saint George, soldier or knight of Christ, redeem me. The spelling of Christi as XBI in Greek letters is perhaps an indication of an Eastern or Balkan origin of the sword. A similar large war sword, or rather its fragments, is on display in the Palazzo Fulcis, and is particularly significant because of where it was found. It was found, namely, in the smithy of the Mezzacasa family, where this family made and grinded blades in the 16th century. And the discovery of a blade from the 13th century in this building suggests that swordsmiths had been working in this place for much longer than we have evidence for. Finally, I would like to present a sword that was found right on the border between Tyrol and Belluno, and in a spectacular place. In the distant year 1802, shepherds found an overlong sword in a sandhill on the Alpe Seeland in the Dorfertal Valley in East Tyrol. Here, an old connection trail led from Obertiljach in the north to the Comelico region in the south. And here, right below the Roskar Spitz, there's a wide and shallow bassin in 2,200 meters sea level. Around the center of this area, a strange-looking cluster of hills catches the eye. They are pretty huge, as you can see here, and this is mostly a geological a result from weathering boulders. And it's very likely that the sword was discovered in one of these sand hills. The sword from the Roskar is a 1.5 weapon from type 18B, popularly known as a bastard sword, and impresses with its slender and elegant design. Added to this is a very long appearing hilt, so that to an amateur the whole weapon can actually appear to be overlong. The sword is 123 centimeters long, not that I wouldn't hear, that's an error, but it weighs only 1.4 kilograms, so it's not very heavy. On both sides of the blade there is a mark inlaid, probably of brass. It shows in a suggested form a Latin cross on a hill. In the Christian iconography, this refers to the cross of Christ on which he was nailed on Golgotha. This was a hint by Peter Jonsson, for which I thank him very much. The question remains why such a high-quality sword was found on an alpine pasture. It had perhaps something to do with the Venetian wars, either by Archduke Sigmund the Münzreichen, so the rich one, or Emperor Maximilian, which both led campaigns against Venice. Perhaps it was a consecration gift for a victorious battle. Unfortunately, we will never know. There are several other swords in the Tyrolean region that are surprisingly similar to the one from Obertiljach. Today, I know at least of 4 of them, and I will present you 2. One comes from the burial of Oswald von Schroffenstein from the church of Landeck. He was the founder of the church and was buried with his beloved sword, as you can see here. And I was able to document it very intensively. And it's, as you can see, it has the same proportion as the one from Obertiljach, and it bears also the nomen sacrum IHS on the pommel. It is very well preserved, and still parts of the grip with the wood and the textile are preserved. The second one, the third one of this family, is nowadays housed in the Bayerischen Nationalmuseum in Munich. It is perhaps one of the most beautiful swords of the Middle Ages. It has a very elaborated pommel with gilding and inscriptions, and also the leather grip is outstanding. But this sword comes not from Munich, but was held in the castle of Ambras near Innsbruck and was sold only in the 19th century to Munich. The similarities of these three swords are so striking that one can assume, at least for the blades, that they came from a common workshop. Since all three swords can be associated with Tyrol, it also seems quite likely that a swordsmith's workshop is to be found in the Tyrolean or perhaps also in the Belluno region. So to conclude my talk today, we have to see this conference not as the end of a project, but as a good start for deeper connections and even more research. Since the Alpine mountains were neither in the Middle Ages nor nowadays strict borders, but their valleys are channels for the stream of wisdom across the Alps. So thank you for your attention and onwards to new discoveries.
Grazie a Florian e ho scoperto che fa parte dello staff del professor Harald Stadler, sì, che è uno dei più noti archeologi medievali che si occupano della zona delle Alpi.
Specialmente del Tirolo orientale.
Del Tirolo, sì. Sia nel Tirolo che nel Sud Tirolo ho scavato da un bel parte, credo. Nella cosa. Molto, molto interessante, bellissima carrellata. Sì. E forse abbiamo capito a cosa si avvicina la spada di stamattina, perché assomiglia molto agli ultimi tipi che abbiamo visto, che però sono ancora più corti di quella, perché mi pare che la lunghezza massima lì era 1,25 m e che arriva a 1,45 m. Per cui vi rendete conto dell'eccezionalità della spada di Formicano che abbiamo visto stamattina. Molte grazie.
Io?
Grazie.